studying a piece of music for symphony orchestra. What is a symphony orchestra? A large group of musicians massed together with their instruments to make a combination of sounds. The symphony orchestra can make almost any sound that you can think of. For example, here's one. And here's another familiar sound. Or this. Seem to be getting closer to what you probably think of as a classical sound. But we haven't yet heard a really symphonic sound. We haven't yet drawn on the potential of all these instruments playing together. In this fanfare by Giuseppe Verdi, we hear the brass instruments, the trumpets, the horns, the trombones, tubas, outdoor instruments, originally used to announce the arrival and departure of great personages. They bring to the orchestra the exciting sounds of the call to arms, the hunt, the battle. And there's another outdoor sound in the orchestra, the woodwinds. They are not so full of pomp and circumstance. Their quality is more pastoral. Listen to this beautiful flute solo from Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe. Except for the flute, all the other woodwind instruments use a reed to produce their sound. A reed is a thin piece of cane. Listen to the oboe play this characteristic passage. woodwinds, and percussion, which accentuate the rhythm and create excitement. But even all of these diverse instruments playing together won't give us the symphonic sound. There it is. That's what makes the difference. The strings. What makes the sound of the symphony orchestra unique is really the massed strings. It is, in a way, a band plus a string section. Every wind player in the orchestra plays a different part, and each has a different instrument. But the strings are often playing exactly the same part in unison. String section developed much the same way the winds did, from primitive instruments. But these were indoor instruments. They were designed for small rooms and confined spaces. These were first played individually, often only as accompaniment for songs and dances. But when they began to play together for audiences that only listened, a change took place. The audience wanted more interesting music, more variety. The chamber orchestra had become a form of entertainment on its own. To make things still livelier, they added solo instruments. A flute. instruments that came in as soloists to add variety stayed and took their place in the orchestra. And it was for this chamber orchestra that contained for the first time all the basic ingredients of the symphony orchestra as we know it, that Mozart and Haydn wrote the great symphonies that became the foundation of the whole symphonic tradition. Here is a bit from Mozart's very last symphony, the Jupiter Symphony. Then something exciting happened. All over Europe, the middle class was on the rise. Music ceased to be the privilege of the aristocracy. It burst out of the private chambers of the courts and manor houses into public halls and theaters. Music had found a new audience, and the old orchestra was not only too small to fill those larger theaters with sound, but too small to express the stirrings of such different emotions. Composers had something new to say, and it was a far cry from what had been evoked by the classical and formal style that had gone before. The bonds which had made that music so docile were broken. It's not accidental that we're playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, for Beethoven has been known as the man who freed music. Mozart was great because of what he did within the form. classicism. Beethoven wanted to create his own form. He was, like today's astronauts, on the frontier of his time, the embodiment of what was to become the feeling of his age, the magnification of emotion, the assertion of the individual, insistence on freedom and the rights of man. In short, romanticism. There's a paradox here, for while romanticism was glorifying the importance of the individual, the separate players in the orchestra were actually losing their individuality. A musician no longer necessarily had his own distinct part to play in this vastly expanded ensemble. Because of this massing of players, a new kind of individual emerged, stepped in front of the orchestra, and took up his baton, the conductor. His instrument was the whole orchestra, the sum of all the parts, and he became responsible for the quality of the performance. To the composer and the conductor, add another group of artists, the virtuoso soloist. The intensity of these men and their emotions forced a change not only in the orchestra and in the way the instruments were played, but physical changes in the instruments themselves. With the invention of the valve, the brass instruments could now play melodies as well as the fanfares we were accustomed to. They were now the equal of the strings and the woodwinds. It remained for a generation of geniuses to develop that potential. And their music grew from much the same roots as their instruments, reaching back into the simple life of the people, brought forward, embellished, glorified. Listen to this bit of Brahms' First Symphony, based on the sort of alpine horn call you may have heard in the Austrian Tyrol. Can't miss the sound of the folk dances, the images of colorful costumes in this piece from Dvorak's New World Symphony. South to Spain, where Defia's fiery spirit could turn the whole orchestra into one tremendous flamenco guitar. Symphonic music was essentially popular music in its own day. The instruments grew out of life situations, as did the music itself. And the composer transformed these raw materials into a glorification of life and feeling, a universal expression of the sorrows, tensions, and joys of man's existence. An expression which has lasted because at its peak, it produced some of the greatest creations of the human spirit. Music reaches out beyond the barriers of time and space. It reaches out to you. With fantastic skill, Tchaikovsky turns a sorrowful Russian folk tune into the climax of his Fourth Symphony.